Hello, and welcome to the Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shunglun, and today I am joined by education specialist, Brodie McGee. How are you doing, Brodie?
Hey Harry, how you going? Good, thanks.
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you. Tell me more about what you do in the space of e-learning and education leadership.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose to start with, my background is I'm a classroom teacher. So I've been a classroom teacher for a few years now. And then after a few years of teaching, I went back and I did some further study. I did in educational leadership. So I spent a few years looking at what good leadership is in the education industry and how that can really be applied in different situations. And then through that, I was looking at development and programs as well, specifically around technology. And at the time, that was kind of to gear towards some further study, which is what I'm doing now. I'm now doing my doctorate in education, specifically looking at educational technologies. So what that looks like for me on a day-to-day basis is I work for a company that schools then consult with us, and I go out to the schools and can do pretty much anything they need from us, from the strategic and the strategy planning through to the actual training and in the classrooms, co-teaching with teachers to show their teachers how to use technology to make engagement and relationships with the students a little bit more meaningful. And I'm smiling, but you can imagine that what that really looks like at the moment is just training after training for teachers of how to teach online and how to do some remote learning.
And I imagine that that's been very relevant, given that we're currently in a pandemic and a lot of teaching has gone digital necessarily. Yeah, what's
Yeah,
been
it's
challenging about
it's
that?
kind of
How's it
the
gone?
it's kind of the irony that when I started this job last year, um, for good reasons, but teachers are not always, and I am a teacher, I can say this, but teachers are not always the most um, open to change in the sense of they're so busy with a million different things that when someone like me comes in and goes, right, let's make some changes and it will help you, they've got enough on their plate. And so the biggest uphill battle that I've found in this role is convincing teachers, selling myself and selling what we do, that it will actually save them time and it will make things easier in the long run. And now that we've hit this remote learning and learning from home period, that everyone that I know, every teacher I work with kind of looks back and goes, I wish I'd listened to you 6 months ago and I would have had the skills already rather than having to kind of play catch up. So in a sense, that's been good because I've been able to go to the teachers, right, well, you've now got these skills. We need to also then plan that once we're back in the classroom, which is happening quite soon, how do we make sure that you don't lose those skills, that these are skills that you've spent quite a lot of time and effort and energy learning. And so the biggest challenge right now that we're kind of over the hump, is the planning, taking a breath and planning that, well, what does this now look like? And a lot of the schools that I work with are really letting this be a period in time where they can reflect that actually the way we used to do things doesn't have to be the way we move forward. And there are a few schools around Melbourne that are really looking at this as an opportunity to embed not just technology, but new ways of teaching into the classroom as well.
I feel like that's a broader thing that the pandemic has forced or gifted us in a way that, beyond education, we have the time to reflect, and we've also been confronted with the different shortcomings of any given system or society itself. What are the things that you've seen people, or specifically educators, doing really badly in this transition to the digital?
Yeah, so in education, there's I guess a few different theories and a few different models that we use. So one of the ones that we really rely on or talk quite heavily about is this idea of Bloom's taxonomy, where if you visualize it as a bit of a pyramid, at the bottom of the pyramid is just that busy kind of work that a lot of students do. And maybe if you're a new teacher or you're quite green, that might be the kind of work that you focus on. But as you get the students more engaged and not just learning a fact, but recreating that knowledge in their own mind, you're kind of moving up towards the transformational end of the pyramid. We use that in the classroom, and we can certainly use it online. But then there's another model called SAMR, SAMR, which is focused purely on technology when it's applied in the classroom or in education. And the first, or at one end of that spectrum, is the idea that we simply substitute. You take what you do in the real world and you apply it online. And then as you move up through that model, at the higher end, you're transforming what you do. You're using technology to do things that wouldn't be possible without the technology. And what we see quite a lot of teachers do is, and I totally understand why, they're so busy and this has just been thrown on them, but they are trying to teach their hour-long or 90-minute lesson that they would do in a classroom, and they're simply transposing that to online. And if you're like me or anyone else I know, if you try and get anyone to sit in a 90-minute long Zoom session, let alone 5 of them in a whole day, you're going to switch off, you're going to lose engagement, and it's just not going to be good. And so teachers who are on the back foot with this, and we can understand why, but teachers who are on the back foot and they're simply doing that substitution, they're teaching their 90-minute lesson online, it really is at the lower end of what could be happening. While if they had the time and the resources and it wasn't because of a pandemic, then we'd be able to do a bit more training around how do we transform that knowledge and that activity into something that's a little bit more engaging. So it's a challenge for everyone, and it's a hard one at the moment.
And so this model that you mentioned, SAMR, which I'm trying very hard not to say ASMR, is like a scale, so to speak, or like a moving from that translation without thought towards a transformative experience that actually uses the digital technology?
Yeah, so to go through the 4 different layers, the first layer is substitution, where literally you take what you do in the classroom and you do it online. So for example, if it was an English class and the task that I had for my students is, I want you to write a paragraph. If I simply got them to write that in a Word document, they're not actually learning anything different. And so we've simply substituted the piece of paper for a Word document. If I then spent a little bit of time and I turned that into a Word document where I then as the teacher will use track changes, where I can then provide feedback and commenting. What I've done then is I've actually augmented the task. So we're still really doing what we could do on paper, but we're now doing it with technology in a different way. And so in the model, it's SAMR, substitution to augmentation. And so doing it a little bit differently. So at the next level is modification. So it's really taking the task, changing the task to incorporate more of the technology. And in this example, what that might be is instead of writing a paragraph on a Word document, I might get my students to write a blog post where they can actually then engage with each other. They can write comments and they can actually engage in a different mode. And really, it's a realistic mode because they will at some point in their lives likely engage with a blog. And so we can start to modify the task to use the technology. And then finally, that transformative idea is that how do we actually use technology to make this a completely different task? So one of the ways I do that with my English classes in the past is using something like, I'm lucky I've got the tech skills behind me, but using a bit of code where they didn't just write a story, but they were able to actually embed code into their story where they would use some if or statements, and they could actually do a bit of a choose your own adventure where there would be a paragraph, and then depending on some input, it would go down one path of the story or another path, and completely using technology in a way that you couldn't really do it in the real world.
That's so good. I did a creative learning partnership with students from Collingwood College in grade 3, and we were using the engine Twine to make choose your own adventure stories. And it's just, it blew me away how good the stories were, for one thing, and how incredibly generous and funny kids are. But the other aspect is like, oh, it'd be so hard if you, as a teacher or educator, didn't have the knowledge that you have or the expertise. How is this going to become democratized to the level where everyone is given access to these technologies?
Yeah, and there's a few different ways where I think that's coming about. In the first instance, some schools are quite lucky that they do have someone like, and not to big head myself, but someone like me. So that is pretty much what my role is in the schools, is when a teacher goes, I wonder how I could do this, or I've got an idea, but I have no idea how to make it happen. My role is for me to be available for that teacher to work with me. I will help them write the curriculum. I will give them the skills, or I'll even come into the classroom and run that part of it with them so they can focus on the English and I'll focus on the coding or whatever it is. And so a lot of schools now will branch out and look for those specialists or those specialty skills, either in their own pool or in a broader pool of people and applicants like me. But the flip side is also really drawing on the skills that other people within the schools have as well. One of the really big benefits, or really positive things that I've seen happen with some schools that I work with at the moment is the move away from what we would call synchronous learning and the blended of synchronous and asynchronous. So in a classroom, if you think of a traditional classroom with a teacher out the front, that's real world synchronous learning. The teacher is talking to the students and there's this two-way flow of information going on. And if you then translate that to online, it's very much like what we're doing now. I'm talking to you, you're talking to me, and it's in the real world. That doesn't work very well when you need to deliver a lot of content over a long period of time, like we talked about before, those 5 90-minute lessons a day or something like that. Children tune out, they're not really interested. And so we need to find ways to we need to find ways to chunk that information. And one way to do that, of course, is what's called asynchronous delivery. So that is the idea of creating chunks of video, and the students can watch those videos in their own time or as much as they need to. And by moving towards that model, it means that instead of let's take, for example, every year 7 science teacher, if a school's got 7 year 7 science classes, instead of 7 teachers having to teach for 90 minutes, it means 1 teacher needs to make 1 video and then 7 classes can watch that video with then a 10-minute bit of time. And so rather than having 7 teachers spend 90 minutes teaching a lesson, we're really condensing that down in the staff sense to only a few minutes, and then the students go and watch 1 video. And once they do that, it means that the staff, the teachers, can actually get a lot more engaged and deeper conversations with their students one-on-one or in a small group like that. And so that's been a really big benefit, and we're really looking at ways that we can make that continue once we're back in the classroom. And there are different ways to do that through blended learning or flipped classrooms, but schools now are starting to really see the value in doing something like that.
I mean, I think this is resonant to a lot of people, not just children, when you say like it's going to be so hard to sit through 5 90-minute blocks. Like, we're all experiencing Zoom fatigue. We're all feeling that same problem of how attention gets mangled by this framework, and how finding like the affordances that are unique to this technologies, it's actually a lot of hard work. And I found in my teaching, at least, like when I'm giving a lecture, I rely so much on the live feedback, on the pacing, on the interaction. And it feels like we've just gone back, or at least in my mind, to some horrific days of the impassive screen person who doesn't have any of the live feedback or interaction. Yeah, I was just like thinking about how even outside of an educational context, I think we're all feeling it. And there's going to be 1,000 think pieces on this. Do you have a solution to Zoom fatigue? Because even in asynchronous learning, students are going to have to be watching a lot of videos, presumably.
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite funny, and just to jump on something you said before. So I started my undergraduate as my Bachelor of Education way back in 2010, and it still sticks with me today. That, as a fresh education student with all this passion to be a teacher, we walk into our first education lecture, and essentially they say, the worst thing that you can ever do is just lecture to your students. And then for the next 4 years, all we got was being lectured to. And it's very much the same, that we can have as many teachers know the fact that it is just not great to Zoom to your students and do relentless videoing, but it doesn't change the fact that unless there is the time, the commitment, and the available energy to change and transform the way that we're teaching, it won't change. Now, I think every teacher has got the commitment. They just don't have the time or the skill set. It's one of those two that is normally holding them back. Either they do have the time because they're putting in the extra hours that they shouldn't have to be doing, or they just don't have the skill set because there is a million other things that they need to be learning. Most teachers are having to learn how to Zoom, let alone how to move past Zoom. But there are a lot of things that teachers can be doing. So the biggest thing that I'm saying to my teachers at the moment is to look at the way that we would set up an online class. Now, we're a bit past this already because most schools will actually be going back in one way or another next week. But the way that we've been getting teachers to do it at our schools is that instead of delivering your lesson for 90 minutes, do a 5-minute check-in, a single 1 video at 5 minutes at the beginning of the lesson, and then possibly 1 more 5-minute video at the end, but just as a check-in. But find different ways throughout that lesson for your students to submit their work digitally, but the work itself shouldn't be digital. There are so many ways that students can engage in real world. So, for example, if I go back to an English classroom, while we need to be really careful around the well-being and the equity issues of access to education for our students, it's more than likely that almost all students will have access to some kind of literature in the house, whether that's comic books, magazines, cookbooks, Bibles, Qurans, like any kind of literature will do. And if you can then do some exercises around things like finding adjectives, finding verbs, find emotive language, there are ways that you can actually do things in the real world and then overlay that with some digital stuff. So for example, there's an app called Office Lens where they can, if you're an Office or a Microsoft schools, they can use this program and automatically store whatever they take a photo of in the student's account for the school. And so whether it's finger painting or they're outside in the dirt, I've seen some really fantastic schools doing things like chalk drawings out on the pavements and stuff to do maths lessons, which has been fantastic. I thought that was a really great lesson. So the biggest thing that I have to overcome the Zoom fatigue is, wherever possible, is delivering lessons not on Zoom. And I know that sounds so weird, but we need to, teachers are always so drilled into us that the well-being and the safety of the student is 100% on us. And that makes sense, that when they're in the schoolyard, we are the legal guardian and the legal responsibility or responsible person for that student. It's a really blurred line that if that student is in an online lesson with me, but they're at home, where that duty of care lies. We need to kind of take a breath and relax a little bit, that we can't control what's happening in their homes. We can control everything within our classroom at school. And that's why we really know, teachers are so great at planning. They know what they're doing. They're on top of everything. It's such a different world now where we can't control what's happening in the students' world anymore. What happens in their homes, we physically cannot change. And we need to kind of remember that. And a lot of teachers, because of that, I guess, fear that they can't control it, but they still care for the student. They want to be on screen with that student as much as possible, but then that doesn't really help. That actually cutting that screen off and letting the student go and play and learn through play or do through play may actually be better for that student's well-being than being on screen for the whole day. And it's just something that we really, understandably, I think a lot of us struggle with.
I think it feeds into the larger conversations about screen time for kids as well, which I won't go too far into because it's been a dead horse that's beaten a bunch. I am curious, though, about broader questions of technology and hype cycles, because your dissertation is going to be on VR.
It is. So generally speaking, I'm looking at educational technologies, and then more specifically, the particular research that I'm looking at is in virtual reality. And in fact, to broaden that, I often just say virtual reality, but I'm looking at extended reality. And the idea of extended reality is there's a concept called a virtual reality learning environment. And whenever I say that, most people kind of picture VR goggles on their head and it's learning through VR like that. That is the path I want to go down. But a VR LE, or a virtual reality learning environment, is actually a learning environment simply delivered digitally. And so students already are receiving this. Almost every school in the world these days has some kind of online learning management system where content is delivered digitally. And even today, we were talking about Zoom, that is still a virtual learning environment. It's not a real learning environment, real world learning environment. And so what I'm really interested in my research is when we go from the classroom to online in videos and Zoom and things like that, what is the learning outcomes that occur between those two? And then more specifically, when we then shift from what we call non-immersive 2D videos to immersive interactive environments, what the learning is in between there. What we know is that things like YouTube videos, and there's a service for education providers called ClickView, which is very similar, but it's more education focused. What we know is those videos are used prolifically in schools, and they have been for some time now. And so there's a lot of research that shows when you go from classroom to video and what the learning outcomes can be when that's done well. What there is very little evidence yet to show is then when you overlay that with an immersive virtual reality environment of some sort. And the reason why there's very little evidence is because the technology changes so fast that once a study is done and it's published 5 years later, the technology doesn't even look like what it looked like at the time. So I'm not sure if you're familiar. A lot of the
has totally disappeared. You're like, oh, how about quick time event games for education? And everyone's looking at you like,
Yeah, absolutely. So you might already be familiar, but it's still around a little bit. But when virtual worlds became a really big thing, there is a program called Second Life, which became really popular. That everyone was really into Second Life, and so there is a million research articles around using Second Life, particularly in the tertiary sector, to deliver education, and so. It's still around and it's still got some really good educational outcomes. But Second Life is not now the big focus of virtual reality. You can still use it with virtual reality. And in fact, it's quite popular with people who do have virtual reality systems. But it is quite an old system now that's been around for some time.
Yeah, Linden Labs. I mean, I remember giving lectures on digital economies based on Second Life, and everyone going, "That's not a thing anymore, right?" I go, "Yeah, you're correct."
Yeah, exactly. And so it really is now. I suppose the two outcomes that I'm looking at in my thesis is what we talked about before, is looking at the measurable learning outcomes that when I deliver a lesson in real life. And I say real life, in reality, when I deliver a lesson using a non-immersive video and when I deliver a lesson using immersive virtual reality, what are the differences in that? But one of the bigger things that I'm looking at is, while that will be nice and that'll help me publish a few papers, what I'm really looking at is something a little bit more applicable for the education sector. I want to look at the actual processes involved in teachers using virtual reality. And I want to come up with, wherever possible, a best practice guide. So when you want to use virtual reality in a school, what are the ethics that you need to consider? What are the well-being implications? What are the technical implications? And what are the actual outcomes you can expect from using it? That's the hope. That's the plan.
That's really exciting. I think this is... there's a definite overlap of interest here because I'm, as a game designer, interested in how people are going to be exploring VR. And one of the challenges for me and reasons I'm reticent to jump into the space is that as it's driven primarily by technology and the technology keeps changing, the questions of who has access to it and how long-lived is this thing going to actually be. Like, if I put all this energy into creating something interesting in VR, then realize that it was all a hype illusion all this time, then I'll be quite disappointed. Do you have any insight into where VR sits in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So each year there's a group called Gartner who put out a report, and that's the hype cycle that you're referring to. It's called the Gartner hype cycle. And people have actually often heard of it, but they might not have necessarily seen it, where there are different stages of the cycle. And we go through this stage of when a technology is first emerged, there's the buzz around it. It's going to be amazing and it's going to do all these sorts of things, and it kind of, the expectations go up exponentially. And that really happened with something like virtual reality, that everyone's going to get a VR headset and we're all just going to be all the time in virtual reality. And if you look at movies and you look at all that sort of stuff, the expectations for VR are up here. What happens then on the cycle is, as people start using it and they realize, it can't actually do what we thought it was going to do, it goes into what's called the trough of disillusionment. Basically, it's this little peak, this little trough where people go, they almost throw it to the side because they were so disillusioned that they thought it was going to do some amazing things, that they just have this resentment towards it, that they don't really then want to push through and find out what it actually can do. And if we can get it through that trough of disillusionment, we eventually get to what we call the plateau of productivity, where the technology actually just works. We know what it does and we know how to use it. at the moment, the 2019 report, which is the most recent report, still had VR and AR, or virtual reality and augmented reality, in that trough of disillusionment, and actually still predicted it was 5 to 10 years away from getting to the plateau of productivity. So even though it's being used a lot more for things like games, the actual productivity side of it, they're still predicting anywhere up to a decade away. And the way that we know that technology changes is you can already imagine that if today's VR is a decade away from being productive, in 5 years, let alone 10 years, that's not even what VR is going to look like anymore. And so it's this really weird thing that it gets to a certain point along the hype cycle, but then the technology changes, that it kind of jumps back to the beginning because they redevelop what the technology looks like. And with that redevelopment, oh, it's going to do all these new amazing things. And nope, it doesn't. And we can't really keep going.
Yeah,
it is interesting.
The eternal trough of disillusionment, I feel.
Yeah, exactly. And so that kind of partners with another report that gets released pretty much each year called the Horizon Report. In fact, the 2020 Horizon Report only came out a couple of weeks ago. And they really do talk about extended realities quite a lot in that as well. And they talk about some of those things that you almost mentioned before that really clearly identifiable. The main reason that education institutions don't use virtual reality is because, in a way, because of the cost. And it's not that the headsets cost much. It's not that the applications cost much. There is a little bit of the training involved in doing it, but it's more the fact that if I am going to teach this particular skill set at school, I need a certain app to do that. The technology is changing so fast that by the time I develop an app to do that, I actually have to go back to the beginning and develop a new app because it's already out of date. And so it's an ongoing cost that until we can prove through the learning outcomes that the learning outcomes are great enough that they're worth the cost, they need to match up in a little bit. And it's really where my research comes into it, because not yet has there been any research to look at what are the learning outcomes. And if eventually we can actually show, hopefully through my research, that the learning outcomes are worth it, then we can say, well, yes, then the cost is worth it. But until we can actually show what the outcomes are, well, we'll never really know, no matter how much money we throw at it, whether it's worth it or not. I think I've frozen. I'm not sure if you can still hear me, Harry, but my screen's frozen. And it's always the irony of the person who works in IT. I'm at a house that I can't even get NVM at. It's something that I hate. So I'll see if I can refresh my screen. Oh, maybe it was you that froze.
It was actually me. So I imagine you just spent the last minute going, oh no, my internet's the cause. I was tethering to my phone thinking it was going to be much faster. And then someone called me, which cuts the connection.
That's right. So maybe any viewers could hear me. I was just saying, I thought it was me that froze, and it was the irony. And I've talked to you about it before, that I, as a person who lives and breathes in the world of technology, I still can't get NBN at my house. And so I thought it was me that froze. It's okay. So
I think this is like very fitting in a conversation about how new technologies are going to be used, that it craps out on us.
Yeah.
Sorry. So it
is interesting.
Go on.
I was going to say, it is actually interesting that you say that. And I know you to be someone who has got some quite good tech skills. But it is actually one of the biggest factors that teachers report for why they don't want to use technology in the classroom, because when something goes wrong, that trying to troubleshoot on the fly when they don't have a high capacity or digital skill set is really hard, but also often embarrassing. That, like, if you've got 25 kids, 30 kids, and their technology knowledge is up here and yours is maybe somewhere else down here, that when you're trying to troubleshoot and they know how to fix it, then that can be a bit confronting as well.
Yeah, maybe this is like part of the cost that you're talking about. It's not just the financial, it's now the emotional, psychic cost of being shown up by these little students of yours. This is not what I meant by flipped classroom. I didn't mean like flip it on me. Anyway, thank you so much for chatting about education and technology, Brodie. It's been such a pleasure. You've got a podcast
anytime
where you talk more about.
I do. So Yeah, that's right. So it's a bit of a work in progress. It's been around for a little while now. I actually started the podcast to talk specifically about education technology, but I really quickly realized, and I've realized the same through my research, that education technology it isn't an isolated phenomena in education. It is so ingrained and tied in with well-being and curriculum and all of the other issues that impact education. And so, yeah, it's kind of a bit of a wondering the discovery of really big education issues and some really fantastic episodes lately around well-being during the COVID-19 time. So absolutely, it's called Educast.
Definitely go check it out. It's you can also find Brodie on Instagram and Twitter at ICT McGee, and through there, I think find the podcast.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Brodie. Take care and chat soon.
Cool. Cheers.
This is The Distillery, and I'm Harry Lee Shanglun. You can find us at distillery.site or on Instagram at distillery.site or on Twitter at distillery site. Thanks so much and see you tomorrow.